It started with the kind of silence that feels too loud. Aisha had always obeyed. For 20 years she'd done everything she was told, smiled when expected, lowered her gaze when necessary, and swallowed her dreams without protest. But that night, as she stood barefoot on the cold stone floor, gripping a clay jug with trembling hands, something inside her fractured. It was past 3 in the morning. The house was asleep, drenched in darkness so thick it felt alive. The wedding dress hung on the door of her mother's room like a ghost, pale and unforgiving in the shadows. Tomorrow, she would belong to a man 3 times her age, a man who barely looked at her face, but that wasn't what made her legs shake or her chest tighten. It was what she had just overheard, a quiet conversation between her father and her future husband behind the thick door of the study. Whispers, but not soft ones. Words like property and shipment and virgin passed between them like currency. They spoke of her like an investment, a transaction, a product to be consumed and passed on. After the honeymoon, she goes to Sheikh Mahmoud, her father said. He'll pay triple for someone that untouched. Her fiancé agreed. And if she resists, then she disappears, like the others. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. And Aisha had never even been part of the conversation. The world tilted. Her knees nearly gave out as she stumbled away from the door, hand over her mouth to smother the scream building in her throat. She wasn't a daughter, wasn't a bride. She was a bargaining chip, a wrapped-up lie in white lace. For a moment she thought she might vomit. The taste of betrayal was acid on her tongue. Everything she believed about her family, about love, crumbled in a single breath. Aisha climbed the stairs in a fog, gripping the railing like it might anchor her to something real. But nothing felt real anymore. In her room, the moonlight poured across the floor, painting the desert outside in silver-blue hues. Beyond that window was death, but also freedom. And for the first time in her life, Aisha knew which one she feared more. Death could take her body. Her family had already tried to take her soul. She moved quickly, pulling on the sturdiest clothes she had, a worn brown dress, old leather sandals. She grabbed a small knife, a strip of dry bread, the last of the water, and the only thing in the world that meant anything, her grandmother's necklace, still cool from the night air. No note, no goodbye, just breath and instinct. Then she climbed onto the windowsill, her heart punching her ribs, and jumped into the dark. The impact of the fall knocked the breath from her lungs, but the sand beneath her softened the landing enough that she could scramble to her feet. Her knees stung, her palms were scraped, but she didn't stop to check. The house loomed behind her, silent, unmoving, and she stared for one final second. No one would notice her absence until dawn, maybe later. No one would expect her to vanish. That gave her a few hours, at most, to put distance between herself and the nightmare she had once called home. She started walking, each step clumsy at first, the sand giving way beneath her feet. Her body moved without grace, but it moved, and that was enough. Soon she was running, the wind cold, the silence broken only by her breaths and the thud of her sandals against the ground. The desert swallowed her, vast and unknowable, its dunes rising like ghosts in the darkness. Aisha didn't know where she was going, only that she had to go, away from the voices that sold her, away from the men who laughed about breaking her slowly, away from the veil of obedience that had smothered her since childhood. With every dune she climbed, the village became smaller, fainter, until it was no more than a dot in her memory. Her throat burned, her legs ached, but stopping meant death, or worse. Time blurred. Hours bled together beneath the pale moon and the fading stars. The cold seeped into her bones, cruel and relentless, as the night wore on. The desert was not a kind place. It wasn't meant for girls like her, sheltered, pampered, told to stay quiet and smile. But Aisha preferred its brutal honesty to the poison disguised as protection in her old life. Her water ran low within the first hour, her sips measured and precious. Her feet blistered, sand grinding into skin. But she didn't cry. She wouldn't give her father that. The sky began to lighten in the east when she heard the first shout. Distant. Male. Her blood turned to ice. They'd noticed. She turned her head back and saw tiny flames dancing in the distance. Torches. The search party. Panic surged through her as she ran harder, limbs screaming in protest. Behind her, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet like gunfire. Aisha pushed herself harder, faster, ignoring the sand pulling at her ankles, the fire in her chest. They would not take her. Not like that. Not again. She barely made it to a rocky outcrop that jutted from the sand like a miracle. A handful of large boulders stacked awkwardly, creating pockets of shadow and concealment. Aisha dove between them, her body slamming into stone, breath hitching from the pain. She tucked herself into the narrowest space she could find, curling tight like a child, her hands gripping her grandmother's necklace like a lifeline. The hoofbeats grew louder, the men shouting orders, the torches blazing against the pre-dawn dark. Dust and sand filled the air as the riders passed within meters. "She's here!" someone yelled. "I saw tracks." More voices. Closer now. She squeezed her eyes shut and held her breath, heartbeat pounding like thunder in her ears. The searchers dismounted, their boots crunching the gravel around her hiding spot. One of them knocked a rock aside so close it brushed her foot. "Nothing here," a man growled after a moment. "Maybe she ran the other way." Silence, then a command. "Keep moving." The footsteps began to fade. One by one they disappeared into the wind, until all that was left was the dying flicker of torches in the distance. Aisha didn't move. Couldn't. She stayed there, wedged between stones, too afraid to believe it was over. When she finally emerged, muscles numb, throat parched, body aching, the sun had begun to rise. The sky was ablaze with color, but Aisha could barely lift her eyes to see it. Every inch of her felt hollowed out. Her legs trembled as she crawled out of her hiding place, her fingers bleeding from gripping sharp stone. The water was gone. The bread, long since eaten. She stumbled forward, not in any particular direction, just forward, because going back wasn't an option. Her lips cracked and bled, her skin raw from wind and grit. For hours she walked, the desert stretching on endlessly, mocking her. Then, just when she thought her body would finally give out, she saw movement ahead. A camel, a man, a stranger with a scarf wrapped tight around his face, scanning the sand like a hawk. Her knees buckled. She didn't even try to stay upright. When Said found her, she was sprawled, half buried in dust. More ghost than girl. He thought she was dead until her chest moved. Barely. He knelt beside her, felt her pulse. Faint, erratic. Then he saw her eyes flicker open, only for a second, and everything in him stilled. Whoever she was, she had fought to live, all the way out here, and something about that wouldn't let him walk away. Said wasn't the type to ask questions. The desert had taught him that some stories came with too much pain to be told out loud. He lifted Aisha into his arms carefully, as if she might shatter from the touch. She was light, terrifyingly light, and hot with the kind of fever that made him glance instinctively at the sun, wondering how long she'd been out here. Her clothes were torn, her skin cracked, and the only thing that stood out was the necklace around her neck. Old, intricate, not the kind of thing someone poor would wear. Still, she had no water, no camel, no pack. No one comes out this far alone unless they have nowhere else to go. Said placed her gently on the camel, supporting her with his own body to keep her from slipping. He pressed a damp cloth to her lips, coaxing a few drops of water past them. She didn't wake, but she stirred slightly, a sound escaping her throat like a wounded animal. Said closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled. He'd buried emotion years ago, when the fever took Soraya, but this stranger clawed at something in him he thought long dead. The ride back to camp was long. Said didn't speak. He just held her steady, his arm around her waist, his thoughts circling endlessly. He didn't know who she was or why she was out there, but he knew what desperation looked like. He'd seen it in the eyes of dying men. This was different. This was someone who had chosen death over something worse, and that choice haunted him as they moved through the dunes. When the tents came into view, dotted like tiny oases across the golden sand, some of the women stepped forward, whispering to each other as they saw him carrying her. "Another?" someone asked, but Said said nothing. He went straight to Zarira, the clan's healer and midwife, a woman who had seen everything and judged little. She took one look at the girl in his arms and nodded. "Inside," she said, opening the flap of her tent. Said laid Aisha down on a mat layered with cushions. She looked impossibly small there. "Now go," Zarira said, not unkindly. "Let me work." He hesitated, just for a heartbeat, then stepped back and left the tent. Outside he stood guard, the desert wind tugging at his scarf, his eyes never leaving the place where a stranger now slept. Hours passed. The sun climbed high and dipped low again, painting the sky in swirls of gold and purple. Still, Said waited. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't answer the questions that trickled in from curious clan members. Who is she? Where did she come from? Why did he bring her? Said just sat, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening, his eyes flicking toward the tent at every sound. Inside, Zarira worked quietly, cleaning wounds, applying salves, forcing tiny spoonfuls of broth between cracked lips. The girl, Aisha, though Said wouldn't know her name until later, drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, never fully waking. She murmured things sometimes. Names. Please. One phrase over and over. Don't sell me. Zarira didn't ask. She didn't need to. The story was stitched across the girl's body. Bruises, raw ankles, cuts from sand and stone, and the necklace, heavy with a past she wasn't ready to tell. When Zarira finally emerged, her hands smelled of herbs and blood. She looked at Said and gave a single nod. She'll live. He didn't reply, but his shoulders relaxed, just barely. Whatever chased her here, Zarira added softly. It must have been worse than anything we can imagine. Said didn't look away. I don't need to imagine. I saw it in her eyes. The next morning, Aisha stirred for real. The fever had broken, and the pain had dulled to a background hum. She opened her eyes to a world she didn't recognize. Warm fabrics, soft cushions, the scent of mint and smoke. She blinked, trying to remember if this was a dream, if she had died in the desert and this was something like paradise. Don't move too fast, came a voice. Calm, wise, and unmistakably female. Zarira sat beside her, holding a bowl of water. You've been asleep for 3 days. Aisha's eyes widened, her mouth too dry to speak at first. Zarira offered the water. Aisha sipped. It felt like life itself. Where am I? She managed, her voice hoarse. Safe, Zarira said. That's enough for now. She explained only what was needed. That Said had found her, that he'd brought her here, and that no one was asking questions yet. Aisha listened, half alert, her mind trying to piece together reality. Said, she whispered. The name meant nothing to her and everything at once. Why would a stranger help me? Zarira smiled with something like sadness. He doesn't help just anyone, she said. Only the ones who are too broken to ask. Aisha spent the next few days in a haze of recovery. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, but for the first time in her life, the pain wasn't inflicted by someone else. It was just survival working its way through her bones. The women in the camp were cautious but kind. They didn't pry. They didn't ask who she was or where she came from. They brought water, simple food, fresh cloth. One of them, a girl barely older than Aisha, even braided her hair while humming a soft tune. And yet, Aisha felt like an outsider, a ghost still tethered to a world that hadn't let her die. She helped where she could, slowly gaining back strength. She sat near the fires, listened to the laughter of children, felt the warmth of a place that didn't feel like a cage. But she also noticed the sideways glances, the whispering that stopped when she walked by. She was a guest, but not yet one of them. Said never came into the tent, but every morning something new appeared beside her. A woven blanket, dried figs, a scarf to protect against the wind. He never said a word, but his silence spoke louder than anything she had ever heard. Why does he do that? She asked Zarira one evening. The older woman stirred the tea slowly and answered without looking up. Because it's who he is, and maybe because you remind him of something he lost. Eventually, Aisha left the tent. Her legs were steady now, her body still bruised but functional. The sun on her skin felt like a second chance. She wandered the edges of the camp, eyes wide, heart guarded. Then she saw him. Sighed. He stood apart, checking the hooves of a camel, his back turned to her. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped and quiet. She didn't know what made her walk toward him. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe curiosity, or maybe something deeper that she couldn't admit yet. Can I help? She asked softly. He turned slowly and looked at her. There was no flicker of surprise in his eyes, only calm. Do you know how to treat a wound? He asked. A little, she replied. He handed her a cloth without another word. They worked side by side, hands brushing occasionally, neither of them speaking much, but something passed between them, not just silence, but trust. When they finished, Aisha stepped back, brushing her hands on her dress. Thank you, she said. Said met her gaze, and for a brief second, his guard slipped. "The desert saves those who deserve it," he said, "and I still don't know if I believe that. But maybe you'll prove me wrong." The camp adjusted to Aisha's presence with a slow, cautious rhythm. She helped wherever she could, grinding herbs, feeding animals, learning to prepare the mint tea the clan drank religiously at dusk. The children grew fond of her first, always the most open-hearted. They tugged at her sleeves and begged her to tell stories. She obliged, offering tales from her childhood, softened, edited, about rainstorms and market days, leaving out the parts that hurt. The women warmed to her gradually, especially when they saw how hard she worked, how she didn't ask for special treatment. Even those who had doubted her presence began to nod her way in quiet approval. Still, Said remained distant. He appeared and disappeared like the wind, always watching, always listening, but never intruding. And yet, Aisha felt him everywhere. He left fruit by the fire, adjusted tent flaps before the evening chill set in. Once, he even fixed the broken handle of a water jug she had been struggling with without saying a word. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to ask him everything, but every time their eyes met, the words stuck in her throat. Because when Said looked at her, it wasn't like a man seeing a woman. It was like a man seeing a question he wasn't ready to answer. Then came the night of the sandstorm. It started as a whisper, a breeze too warm, too dry. Zarira sniffed the air and closed the tent flaps before the first gust hit. "Storm's coming," she said simply. "Big one." The camp reacted with the urgency of people who had survived too many storms to take them lightly. Tents were secured with extra rope, animals corralled into the inner ring, children bundled and brought into the central tent. Aisha followed instructions, her hands working on instinct now. But when Said entered the tent, last as always, his eyes found hers. He scanned the room, too crowded, too loud, and walked straight toward her. "There's no room," someone said. "We're packed already." Said didn't hesitate. "She stays with me." Aisha's heart skipped. "I can—" She started to protest, but he raised a hand, calm but final. "You stay with me." And just like that, the storm outside became a backdrop to something far more frightening. The way her pulse thundered when his hand brushed hers, when he led her into a smaller tent, quieter, darker, just for the two of them. They sat close, because space demanded it, but also because by now, distance had become unbearable. Inside the tent, the storm roared like a living beast. The fabric shuddered against the wind, and the sand scratched like claws across its surface. Aisha sat cross-legged on a thick blanket, her knees brushing Said's as they both tried to ignore how close they were. The light was dim, just a small oil lamp flickering between them, casting long shadows on the canvas walls. Said checked the structural ropes again, adjusting a few knots with calm precision. Aisha watched him, the way his hands moved, steady and sure, even as the world outside raged. "Are you afraid?" he asked without looking at her. She hesitated, unsure which fear he meant. "A little," she admitted. "Of the storm?" he clarified. She shook her head. "Of a lot of things." Said turned, then met her gaze directly. His eyes were so dark they seemed bottomless. "You don't have to be." She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "I'm in a desert, in a tent, with a man I barely know, while a storm tries to tear the world apart. How am I not supposed to be afraid?" Said didn't smile. "Because you're not alone anymore." And somehow in that moment she wasn't. The hours stretched long. The storm wouldn't let up, and neither did the tension between them. It wasn't spoken, but it filled the space like smoke. Aisha shifted slightly, brushing her arm against his. He didn't move away. Her heart thudded, not from fear now, but from something unfamiliar and dangerous. "Want? Do you miss her?" she asked softly, barely above a whisper. Said looked down at his hands. "Every day," he said, "but not the way I did before." She didn't push. Some wounds needed silence. "She must have been special," Aisha said. Said's eyes flicked to hers again. "She was," he said, "but she's gone. And you're here." The words landed heavy between them, neither invitation nor warning, just truth. A gust of wind slammed into the side of the tent, making Aisha flinch. Instinctively, Said reached out, his hand finding hers, their fingers laced without thought. Neither of them looked away. "It's just a storm," he murmured. But they both knew it wasn't. The real storm was inside them now. Years of grief, weeks of tension, and a heat that had nothing to do with the desert. They didn't kiss that night. Not yet. But something shifted irreversibly in the way they sat together after that moment. Said's hand never left hers, and Aisha didn't want it to. It wasn't about lust. Not entirely. It was about the weight of being seen, really seen, for the first time in what felt like forever. Said didn't ask for her story. He didn't need to. She could feel it in the way he held her gaze, in the way his thumb moved gently over the back of her hand, that he already knew the shape of her pain. Outside, the storm began to weaken, its fury spent. Inside, a silence settled between them, but it was warm this time. The kind of silence that feels like understanding. When Aisha finally leaned her head against his shoulder, Said let her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let her be. She stayed that way until her breathing slowed, until her muscles relaxed, until the scent of him, leather, sand, and something deeply human, became familiar. And in that fragile space between exhaustion and peace, she realized she hadn't felt safe in years. Not until now. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in soft dunes and golden dust. Everything needed cleaning, rebuilding. The camp stirred slowly back to life, tents flapping lazily in the breeze, camels snorting, children reappearing like magic from hiding. Aisha emerged from Said's tent just before sunrise, the air still cool, the sky washed in pink. She expected stares, whispering, accusations, but what she found instead was something quieter. Curiosity, yes, but not hostility. Zarira met her with a knowing nod. "You slept well," the older woman said without inflection. Aisha simply nodded. She wasn't ready to define what had happened, or what hadn't, and no one asked her to. Said remained focused on his duties, issuing commands, helping fortify the weaker tents. But Aisha noticed how his eyes always found her across the camp, just for a second, then gone, like a secret only they shared. That afternoon, she found herself humming as she worked, grinding herbs beside Zarira. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time music had lived inside her chest. "You're healing," Zarira said gently. Aisha didn't reply, but her fingers moved a little lighter. Her breath came a little easier. She was still a stranger here, but maybe not for much longer. Days passed, and with each one, Aisha became less of a stranger. She no longer flinched at sudden noises. Her shoulders weren't always drawn tight to her ears. The children called her by name now, and the women invited her to sit closer by the fire. She learned to thread wool, to mix herbs for headaches, to carry water in clay jars without spilling. They taught her not out of obligation, but as a test, to see if she belonged. And Aisha wanted to belong, not just to the camp, but to something that didn't hurt, something that didn't trade her. She found moments of quiet happiness, laughing at a toddler's stubborn tantrum, burning her fingers while helping to bake bread, losing herself in the rhythm of morning chores. But Said remained distant, not cold, but measured. He still left small things outside her tent, still watched her when he thought she wouldn't notice. But he kept space between them, as if afraid that stepping closer might shatter what they had not yet dared to name. And Aisha, though she craved that closeness, respected it, because she understood now. He had scars too, not all visible, not all from the desert. It wasn't until the night of the music that something changed. One of the older women began playing a stringed instrument by the fire, a haunting, drifting melody that clung to the air like smoke. Others clapped softly, a few began to sing. "Dance," a little girl urged Aisha, tugging at her sleeve. "Please?" Aisha froze. She hadn't danced since her world had collapsed. But the music tugged at something deep inside, something older than pain. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the camp. Said was there, leaning against a post near the tents, arms crossed, watching, not with command, not with judgment, just watching. Aisha stepped forward. The sand was soft beneath her feet, the fire warm on her skin. She began to move, slowly at first, her body unsure, then more freely. Her arms traced patterns in the air, her hips swayed to the rhythm. The laughter of children mixed with the song. She let herself feel, not watched, not possessed, but free. And for one heartbeat, she looked at Said. He hadn't moved, but his eyes had changed. They burned, with memory, with desire. with something else. Fear, maybe. Or the beginning of something he no longer knew how to fight. That night, Aisha lay awake beneath soft blankets, staring at the roof of the tent, the music still echoing faintly in her bones. The way Said had looked at her during the dance, it wasn't something she could forget. It was the kind of look that made time slow down, that peeled away every mask and left only truth. But he hadn't approached her afterward. He'd disappeared into the shadows, the same way he always did when his emotions threatened to surface. Still, something had changed. She could feel it in the air between them. Thicker now, charged. The next day, they didn't speak, not because of distance, but because there was too much to say, and no words felt right. It wasn't until 2 nights later, when another sandstorm began to brew in the horizon, that their paths crossed again. Said was inspecting the tents, tightening ropes, ensuring nothing would collapse under pressure. Aisha stepped out to help without needing to be asked. He handed her a rope and their fingers touched, lingered just a moment too long. Then they both pulled back, as if burned. "Storm's going to be strong," he muttered, not looking at her. "I can handle it," she replied. Her voice was steady, but her heart was not. When the storm hit, it was violent, louder, angrier than the last. Everyone took shelter in the central tent again, huddled tight. Space was scarce. Said stood at the edge, scanning the crowd, until his eyes met Aisha's. Without a word, he took her hand and led her toward a corner, the same one they'd shared before. But this time, something was different. He didn't sit at a distance. He sat close, so close their shoulders touched, their legs pressed side by side. Neither said a word for a long time. The wind howled like an animal outside, sand lashing the tent walls. Inside, Aisha could hear only her breathing and his. "You're not afraid," Said finally said. "Not of the storm," she replied. "Of what then?" he asked. She hesitated. "Of what I feel when I'm near you." That made him turn his head. Their eyes locked, no longer hiding. "Me too," he admitted. Then, softer, "It's been a long time since I felt anything." She didn't reach for him. He didn't move closer. But the space between them disappeared all the same. It was no longer a question of if, only when. The storm raged on, but inside their small corner of the tent, everything else faded. There was no camp, no past, no future, just them, and the fragile truth blooming in the space between breaths. Aisha felt his gaze on her, heavy but not oppressive. It was the weight of someone who saw her fully and didn't look away. She turned to him slowly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Said, if I'm a danger to your people, you should say so now." He didn't answer right away. He watched her with a look that seemed to see through the skin into the marrow. "You are a danger," he said at last, his tone quiet and devastating. "But not to them, to me." Her breath caught. "Why?" she asked. Said's jaw tensed. "Because you make me want things I promised I'd never want again." The confession hung in the air like thunder. Aisha felt her throat tighten, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I know," he said, his hand brushing hers, deliberate this time. "That's what makes it worse." They were inches apart now. The storm shrieked, shaking the walls around them, but neither flinched. "Said," she breathed, "if I ask you to kiss me right now, will you regret it?" His eyes darkened, not with fear but with something older, deeper. "Only if you ask me to stop." And she didn't. Their lips met in the shadow of the wind, not gently, not cautiously, but like the world had been holding its breath for this moment. Said kissed her like he had no choice in the matter, like it had been inevitable from the second he found her in the sand. Aisha melted into him, her fingers threading through his scarf, pulling him closer. His hands were firm on her waist, grounding her, igniting her. The tent, the wind, the fear, all of it disappeared. It was only his breath against her mouth, his body pressed to hers, and the long, slow ache of finally being wanted not as a thing, not as property, but as a woman. When they finally broke apart, it wasn't because they wanted to, it was because they had to breathe. Said's forehead rested against hers, his hand still holding her like she might vanish. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "and I don't care." He nodded once, more to himself than to her. "Then we'll face it together." Outside, the storm began to die. Inside, something new had begun, fierce, terrifying, and unstoppable. The next morning, the camp buzzed with quiet awareness. No one said anything outright, but Aisha could feel the shift in how people looked at her. More curious, more calculating. Some with softness in their eyes, others with suspicion. Said, as always, moved through the camp with purpose, issuing orders, checking on the elderly, making repairs. But his path crossed hers more often now, his eyes lingering longer. When their hands brushed, neither of them pulled away. Zarira noticed, of course. She always noticed. That afternoon, as Aisha helped grind herbs, Zarira leaned in close and murmured, "He hasn't looked at anyone like that in years." Aisha didn't reply, didn't know how, because part of her still wondered if this was real, if what they had wasn't just the product of isolation, trauma, and borrowed time. That night, when Said left a woven bracelet beside her tent flap, her heart ached with something warm and terrifying. He was trying, in his way, not with words, but with offerings, as if he was asking permission to hope again. But not everyone welcomed that hope. Kalima returned 3 days later, the clan's matriarch, with a voice like stone and eyes that missed nothing. She arrived just after dawn, dismounting from a fine horse, her silver-streaked braid swinging behind her like a banner. The camp shifted instantly. Conversations stopped. Children were pulled close. Aisha was collecting water when she first saw the woman, and it took only a second for Kalima's sharp gaze to find her. Their eyes met, and Aisha felt the scrutiny like heat on her skin. Kalima didn't speak. She simply looked, and it was enough to freeze the air. Later, behind closed flaps, Kalima and Said spoke in hushed, urgent tones. No one heard the words, but everyone felt the tension. That night, Said didn't appear. No bracelet, no glances, only distance. Aisha lay awake, staring at the stars beyond the tent roof, a familiar dread tightening her chest. She didn't need to be told. She knew how power worked. She had escaped one cage, but she might have walked straight into another. And this time, love might not be strong enough to open the door. By morning, the camp whispered like dry leaves. Kalima hadn't spoken publicly, but her presence alone was enough to shift the balance. She moved through the tents with practiced authority, exchanging nods with elders, watching everything. Aisha tried to go about her routine, fetching water, helping with the younger children, mending a torn blanket. But everywhere she went, eyes followed. Not just with curiosity now, but with judgment. She could feel the pressure building, like the silence before a storm. Zarira kept close, more protective than usual, her hand occasionally brushing Aisha's arm in quiet reassurance. "She's going to try something," Zarira said low that afternoon, as they stirred a pot of lentils. "Kalima?" Aisha asked. Zarira nodded. She doesn't like disruptions, especially when they come wrapped in youth and softness. That evening, Said finally sought her out, finding her alone by the camels. His face was drawn, his shoulders stiff. "She thinks you're a threat," he said without preamble. "To what?" Aisha asked. "To everything she spent years trying to keep in balance." Said looked at her then, eyes dark with conflict. "And maybe she's not entirely wrong." Aisha didn't flinch. She was tired of being seen as danger simply for existing. "Do you believe her?" she asked. Said hesitated. "I believe that you've changed something. In me, in the camp. And change always brings resistance." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But I also believe in what I feel, and I won't be told to unfeel it." Aisha reached for his hand, curling her fingers around his. "Then we stand together." Said exhaled slowly, squeezing her hand once. "There's more," he said. "She's suggesting we marry." The words hit Aisha like cold water. "What?" "She says if we're officially joined, no one outside the clan can lay claim to you. It would make you part of us. Untouchable by law." Aisha's breath caught. "And you? Do you want that?" Said looked at her, really looked. "I didn't expect to. I never planned to feel this way again. But now I don't want to imagine this camp without you in it." Aisha swallowed hard. "And what if I say yes?" "What then?" Said's expression softened, but his voice was steady. "Then we face the fire together, whatever comes." They married the same day, not because they were rushed, not because of fear, though fear was there, like a shadow in the corner, but because waiting felt foolish when so much was already at stake. The ceremony was simple, quiet, and respectful. A ring of clan members gathered in the evening light, the sun melting into the dunes behind them. There were no elaborate robes, no music, No extravagant gestures, just words, just intent. Zarira stood between them, her hands raised in blessing, her voice firm as she spoke the ancient vows. Said's hand never trembled when he took Aisha's. Her eyes never left his face. When the final words were spoken and the circle murmured their approval, something shifted in the air, a fragile, sacred kind of stillness. Aisha was no longer a visitor, no longer an outsider. She was his, and he was hers. Not in the way men like Sheikh Mahmud claimed women, but in the way people choose each other when they have every reason to run and still stay. That night, they walked back to their shared tent, not as strangers, not as saviors and survivors, but as equals. The flap closed behind them, and the desert, for once, held its breath. Inside, the tent was lit with small, flickering lanterns, a quiet gesture from Zarira and the others. Blankets had been laid carefully, incense burned in a small clay bowl. Aisha stood in the soft light, the weight of the day settling in her bones. Said approached slowly, cautious, reverent. "We don't have to rush anything," he said, voice low. "You've been through enough." Aisha stepped closer, resting her hands gently on his chest. "I know," she said, "but I'm not afraid of you." He leaned his forehead against hers, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You're more than I ever thought I'd find again." They undressed slowly, without urgency, without performance. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about presence, about being there, fully, completely. Every touch was a question asked and answered. Every kiss, a promise not spoken, but understood. When they finally came together, it wasn't perfect or choreographed. It was raw, honest, healing. Afterward, Aisha lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Said's fingers traced lazy circles along her spine. "This," she whispered, "feels like something we stole from the world." He smiled faintly in the dark. "Or something the world finally owed us." For a while, the peace held. The camp adjusted, slowly, cautiously, but it did. Aisha and Said moved through their days as husband and wife, not parading their bond, but not hiding it either. Some nodded in approval. Others, like Kalima, kept their distance, watching with an expression that was neither acceptance nor defiance, just cold calculation. Aisha worked hard to be useful, to not just exist within the clan, but contribute to it. She helped with weaving, learned how to prepare dried meat for storage, even taught the children to read the few words she remembered from school. In the evenings, she and Said shared quiet meals beneath the stars, conversations whispered between bites, fingers brushing as they passed water between them. But despite the warmth blooming between them, they were not naive. Kalima's silence was not surrender. It was strategy. Said remained vigilant, waking early, checking the perimeter of the camp, speaking less than usual. Something was coming. They could both feel it in the way the air moved, the way conversations paused too quickly when they entered a room. And then, one hot afternoon, it arrived. A rider appeared on the horizon, tall and proud on a sleek black horse. Dust swirled around him as he approached, the entire camp slowing to a hush as the man dismounted near the central tent. He was dressed too finely to be a traveler. Polished boots, intricate stitching on his robes, the kind of clothing no one wore by accident. Said stepped forward, his stance composed, but his body tense with readiness. "Who are you?" he asked. The man didn't smile. "I bring a message," he said, voice calm but edged with threat. "From Sheikh Mahmud." Aisha froze where she stood, her hand clenching around a water jug. Said didn't look back at her, but she knew he'd sensed her reaction. "We don't have business with Mahmud," Said replied. The messenger's eyes flicked across the camp, scanning every face. "One of your people took something that belongs to him. A woman, young, dark hair, eyes like fire. She ran on the eve of her wedding." Aisha's heart pounded so hard she was sure they could all hear it. "He wants her returned," the man continued, "or there will be consequences." Said's voice was low, even. "There are no possessions here, only people." The messenger stepped closer. "Then your people may pay the price for her freedom." The camp rippled with unease after the messenger left. He hadn't made overt threats, but the meaning was clear. If they didn't hand Aisha over, violence would follow. Said gathered the elders that evening under the main tent. Aisha stood just outside, listening as voices rose and fell. Some argued in her defense. Others questioned whether it was worth the risk. She is one woman. One voice said, "We have children here, families." Said's reply came quiet but firm. "She is my wife, my responsibility, and no one here is for sale." Still, the uncertainty was thick in the air. That night, Aisha couldn't sleep. She lay on the blankets, watching the outline of Said's shoulders in the moonlight. "They're afraid," she whispered. He didn't move. "They have a right to be," he said, "and I have a right to protect what's mine." She sat up. "I'm not something to be fought over." He turned to her, his face shadowed but his voice steady. "You're not, but I chose you, and I don't back down from what I choose." She touched his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "And if people start turning on us?" she asked. "Then we remind them who we are," he said, "and we stand together." But the cracks had already started to show. Over the next 2 days, Aisha felt them widening. Whispers grew sharper. Tasks were forgotten around her. Some women stopped including her in their conversations. The children were pulled away a little sooner, their mothers calling them with tighter voices. Said remained a constant, solid, dependable, loving, but even he could feel the ground shifting beneath them. One evening, Zarira pulled Aisha aside. "There are talks," she said gently. "Kalima is pushing people to choose safety over loyalty." Aisha swallowed hard. "You mean she wants them to hand me over?" Zarira didn't deny it. "She's using fear. It works better than logic." Aisha folded her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the heat. "Maybe I should go. Maybe if I leave quietly." "No," Zarira said firmly. "You don't run again. You already paid that price." But Aisha could feel the storm brewing, and this one wouldn't be stopped by ropes or shelter. This one would test everything she and Said had built, and it wouldn't wait much longer to arrive. It happened faster than either of them expected. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Kalima called for a council, an emergency meeting. Said wasn't surprised, nor was he naive. He knew what this was. The elders gathered inside the central tent, the rest of the camp lingering just outside, trying to listen without seeming to. Aisha stood in the shadows, unseen, but fully aware. "We've always been a peaceful people," Kalima began, her voice calm but calculated. "But peace comes from balance, from understanding that one person's desires cannot endanger many." Said's jaw tensed, but he said nothing yet. "The girl," Kalima continued, pointedly not calling Aisha by name, "has brought danger to our gates, and now we must decide if her presence is worth the cost." Said stood then, tall and steady. "She is not a danger. She is my wife. And that is the only reason we haven't already voted." Kalima snapped back. "But love does not shield us from consequence. You made a choice. Now we must make one too." Murmurs stirred. Said looked around the room, searching the faces of men and women he'd led for years. Some met his eyes. Others looked away. "I won't let her be taken," Said said, his voice a low tremor that carried weight. "Then what?" Kalima challenged. "You'll fight off Mahmud's men alone? You'll let children die to protect someone we barely know?" Aisha's body went rigid in the shadow of the tent. She could hear every word, and each one felt like a stone added to the weight on her chest. "What do you suggest?" Said asked, though he already knew. Kalima smiled tightly. "A vote. Let the people decide. They'll choose fear," he said bitterly. "They'll choose survival. As they should," Kalima said. "You taught us that." Said looked down, the ache in his chest sharper than any wound. He had saved Aisha from the desert, but he couldn't save her from this. Outside, Aisha stepped away from the tent, her mind reeling. Maybe Kalima was right. Maybe her presence had become poison. But as she stared across the sands that once tried to claim her, something hardened inside her. She had come too far, lost too much to be cast aside again. And if the choice was between running or being erased, she would choose neither. That night, the vote was scheduled, not behind closed flaps, but in the open, beneath the stars, as tradition demanded. The camp gathered in tense silence, families huddled together, children whispering questions they didn't understand. Aisha stood beside Said, her hand in his, even as her heart pounded with dread. Zarira stood with them, a rare public gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Kalima stood tall before the crowd, her voice calm, confident. "This is not about cruelty," she said. "This is about preservation. We must decide what ensures our future. Do we protect one or all?" Said stepped forward then, his voice steady but laced with fire. If we abandon the people who need us most, we are already lost. Murmurs followed. Some nods. Some turned heads. Then, one by one, they began to vote. A hand raised in support. Averted eyes for dissent. It was close. Too close. Aisha watched every face, each gesture like a blow to the chest. And then, it was done. Kalima turned slowly, eyes sweeping the crowd. "The vote is final," she said. "By a margin of 1, she stays." A collective exhale rippled across the camp. Relief for some, resentment for others. Aisha's knees nearly gave out. Said caught her, held her close. But even as they clung to one another, Aisha knew the cost. The vote might have declared her safe, but safety was now fragile, conditional. That night, Said didn't sleep. He sat outside their tent, staring into the distance, hand gripping the hilt of his blade. "It's not over," he said when Aisha joined him. "They'll come." Mahmoud doesn't let go. She sat beside him, wrapping her arm through his. "Then we face them," she said. Said didn't argue. He just nodded once, solemnly, and they waited. For 3 days, the camp held its breath, until finally, they arrived. A dust trail on the horizon. 10 riders, armed, determined. Aisha felt the chill before they even dismounted. She and Said stood together at the front of the camp, backed by a wall of silence. The lead rider stepped forward, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. "We've come for what's ours," he said simply. Said didn't flinch. "She is not yours. She is my wife. She is free." The rider laughed. "Freedom is a word men like you use until they bleed for it." Said's hand moved toward his sword. "Then let's see who bleeds first." What followed was not a battle. Not in the way legends are sung. It was swift, brutal, and chaotic. The riders surged forward, expecting submission, not resistance. But Said had prepared. The moment they crossed into the camp, his men moved. Not many, but enough. Omar, silent and sharp-eyed, took down the first with a well-aimed blade. Zarira's sons blocked the flanks. Women shouted warnings, pulling children behind tents. Aisha stood in the center, heart racing, wanting to run, but rooted by something fiercer than fear. Said moved like a storm, precise, relentless. Steel clashed against steel. Sand kicked into the air, and cries of pain filled the wind. Aisha watched in frozen horror as Said was surrounded by 2 men. One slashed toward his side. She screamed, but he twisted away, countered, struck. Blood soaked the sand. One rider fell, then another, but it was far from over. A blade nicked Said's shoulder. He staggered. Aisha took a step forward before Zarira pulled her back. "Don't," she hissed. "He fights for more than his life now." Aisha's vision blurred. She wanted to scream, to help, to stop the world from collapsing. And then, silence. The last rider dropped his weapon. One by one, the others followed suit, or fell where they stood. Said stood in the center, breathing hard, blood dripping from his arm. His eyes scanned the camp, wild with fury and fear, until they found hers. Aisha broke free from Zarira's grip and ran to him. He caught her mid-sprint, his arms tightening around her, the world fading into that embrace. "You're hurt," she said, her voice cracked with tears. "It's nothing," he replied, but he leaned against her all the same. Around them, the camp stared, not just in relief, but in awe. Said had done what few dared. He had defied power, for love, for choice, for her. Later, as the injured were tended and the bodies removed from the sand, Said sat beside the fire, his hand in Aisha's. "They'll send more," he said quietly. "They always do." Aisha met his gaze. "Then we'll be ready. Together." He didn't speak again, just pulled her close and let the fire crackle between them. And for the first time in days, Aisha believed in tomorrow. The days that followed were quieter, but not free of tension. The camp bore its bruises, some visible, some not, and yet life began to resume. Children played again, the animals calmed, and the fires burned steady at night. No one questioned Aisha's place anymore, not openly. She worked alongside the women, shared meals with the others, slept in Said's arms as if she'd always belonged there. The whispers had stopped, not because fear was gone, but because respect had replaced doubt. Said, too, had changed. There was something lighter in his steps, a calm in his voice that hadn't been there before. He still rose early, still watched the horizon, still sharpened his blade each night, But now, when he returned to their tent, he smiled. Just a little. Just enough. One evening, as the sun melted into the dunes and the air cooled with promise, Aisha found him sitting beside the well, a half-carved wooden pendant in his hand. "For you," he said simply, offering it to her. She turned it over, their initials etched carefully into the grain. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," he said, pulling her gently into his lap. She leaned against him, the silence between them full of things that didn't need to be said anymore. That night, she dreamed of her past. Not the pain, but the moments of light that had kept her going. Her grandmother's songs, the feel of warm bread, the first time she saw the stars and knew the world was bigger than her cage. When she woke, Said was already up, tending the fire. She watched him for a long time, feeling her chest fill with something unshakable. Not fear, not longing, but certainty. She had survived, she had escaped, and now she had chosen. Not just a man, not just a camp, but a life. A life where she was not an object, not a burden, but a woman who had run through the night and built a home with her own bare hands. When Said returned with water and offered her the first drink, she took it, smiling softly. "Thank you," she said. He tilted his head. "For what?" She laced her fingers with his. "For seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the desert whispered, not with threat, but with peace. And Aisha, at last, knew what it meant to be truly free.